was everywhere in Florence, so I grabbed a copy and took notes. Like Rodoreda, it's full of vegetable metaphors, flowers, trees, blossomings. So I would, make lists, and with the idea of, trying to find strategic points where I could, incorporate these, looking for, discursive strategies that would function, creating this new, this new identity. There were times that there was no clear meaning in the Catalan. So as an interpreter, as a translator, you have to interpret, you have to provide a meaning. So I found myself doing that. Other times I found that you could leave the reader to interpret. One example that comes to mind is the narrator goes into the water, into the river, where the river plays an important role in the novel. And so the narrator goes into the thin water. So of course this is a literal translation. Presumably this means the narrow, the shallow water. But this was a case when I thought you could leave the interpretation to the reader. I looked for analogies in the English language literature. So this fairy tale world that Rodoreda is giving us brought to mind several things. Angela Carter, Robert Coover, these fairy tales, these retold fairy tales for adults. There were writers about in Rodoreda's generation. Shirley Jackson came to mind, a collection of short stories. If you've read The Lottery, there was something very similar at the end of Death in Spring with a drawing of lots to see who will die. But in Jackson's, it's very much a scapegoat theme, not in Rodoreda. Often the problem was in the English language. I can give one example. There's this recurrent theme from the first page to the last with the wisteria that is pulling up houses. So it's pulling up the houses or toppling the houses. But in this novel where nothing is normal, this surreal world, well, wisteria pulling up houses was just too tame. So I spent weeks trying to find a word for this. So finally, what I came with, we'll have to see what the editors think. I went to a neologism, and we have the wisteria up-wrenching houses, which, in a novel where nothing is normal, for houses to be up-wrenched by wisteria sounded logical to me. So, but there was really no context for, this novel in English literature, or in Catalan literature for that matter. So, nothing finally could be domesticated.
It's a weird contrast to your story in a way, because they always say there's the novels that kind of teach you how to read them as you go along. Like they had their own sort of quirks and you figure out what's going on. Antonio Lobo Antunes comes to mind in terms of that. But it seems to me like American writers can get away with that more than translations. Like in a translation, if you use neologism and different kind of techniques and strangeness, it's a bad translation, or it's not American, it's not in the language yet. Whereas with Americans that fool around with stuff, it's usually, this experimental and avant-garde. So it's interesting. The book sounds even better than I thought originally. But I do want to talk to you more about Catalan being cool, but I also want to draw Edward in to tell me how you got into translating graphic novels. Because what's interesting to me about that, there's a lot of things, but one of them is that when people talk about the publishing industry, they frequently say it's dying, that there's all these problems, that things aren't selling as well as they used to, fiction doesn't sell, people don't read, blah, blah, blah. All the endless things that you can find online. But graphic novels are the one weird growth area for publishing. So it's interesting how you got into translating, because I know you translate surrealist stuff, other straightforward fiction, but then how you got into doing the graphic novel stuff as well.
Well, there's that Johnson line with no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money, right? So I clearly we know that translators do it for love, but I mean I got into translating graphic novels purely on a gig, cash gig basis. I mean, I had always been interested in graphic novels. I've written some short comics in collaboration and had like artists draw them. But the first graphic novel, or let's say novel-length sequential art book that I did was something called Penguins on Ice, which was a collection of one-page gag strips about the hardships of Antarctic life. It was for a publisher who had contracted me to translate 4 French comics, and after the second, they went bankrupt because the founding editor died in a car crash at the age of 46 in Long Island. So after that, it was a good long while until another year and a half of attending comic conventions and just talking to people, because it's really actually a fairly small world. Comics has been out of the limelight for so long, especially independent or art comics, that now that all the big publishers are interested in it and all have their own imprints, it still isn't growing quite as fast as especially not in terms of translation. It's growing in terms of picking up domestic talent, but I mean, for instance, NBM based in New York and Drawn Quarterly in Montreal are 2 of the biggest independent North American independent comics publishers who do a regular amount of French in translation, and they've both been working with the same translators for pretty much forever. My first job, better paying and sort of more mainstream comic job was with a publisher called First Second, which, oddly enough, it sort of spearheads this growth of mainstream publishers into the art comic field, because they have an editor who's bilingual, who worked in children's books for a long time, who has all the power of the Holt Spring Macmillan conglomerate behind him in terms of deep pockets, but at the same time is an artist himself and just knows the French scene and targets a lot of the same writer artists that NBM and Drawn Quarterly target. And so he combines an indie sensibility with the buying power of a major corporation, for better or for worse. Well, I like to think largely for better. I mean, through him, I've been able to work on a lot of French comics creators that I really admire. I mean, I haven't been able to do maybe some, like Louis Trondheim or Johan Spar. I've been mostly working on their children's books, and instead of the material that I think is really groundbreaking. But it's still it's neat to see. It's neat to see that side, because they're sort of endlessly inventive, and actually what Michael said about Japanese writers just writing for a slew of houses is also true of them. They publish with several different publishers in France, and you see the whole range of their work.
What specific challenges do you face in translating graphic novels? Because it seems like at first glance it could be easier, so to speak, than compared to like a story, because you don't have the same kind of descriptive things. You don't have to do that. You don't have any descriptive prose that's drawn. It's mainly generally dialogue, I assume, some other stuff. But it seems like there's also something more difficult to it that I'd like to hear what you...
Well, there are a lot of things that you borrow from the fiction translator's toolkit. I mean, establishing voice, not only for any sort of narration, but also for the individual characters and making sure they're distinct. Because I worked a lot in children's graphic novels, there's a lot of wordplay that has to come over, and this also has plugs into the theme of how much latitude you have to change things for the American market, because pretty much, since these are large commercial endeavors,